on a very human level that when this happened in New York City, the world stopped, rightfully so, right? The world stopped, nations showed their solidarity with us, everyone proclaimed this war against terrorism, but yet, when this was happening in Israel, people were basically silent, and that's what disturbed me. So my curiosity grew, but things basically remained very calm for me. I had some random questions from friends throughout that year, but nothing major. It was only when I got to university that something changed. And I went into university like any good student for political science. I was ready to learn, ready to take over the world. I was super excited, enthusiastic. I was going to a private school in New York City. Who's ever going to ask me a question about Israel? There are plenty of Jews in this city. I don't need to worry about it. Let me go about my life. And I was even more enthusiastic about my university education because I was given a full scholarship to university by Jerry Seinfeld and his family. And when I remember sitting in the room with the Seinfelds, who were, when they were awarding all of the scholars our scholarships, and they asked each one of us, where do you see yourself? Of course, that famous question, where do you see yourself in 10 and 20 years' time? No one really knows, but you always want to say something good. And I remember I turned around and I said to Jerry and his sister, I said, I'm going to be the mayor of New York City. And he looked at me, and I'll never forget this, and he said, you know what, Michelle? I believe you. Go for it. And I said, okay. Here I am, super enthusiastic about university, my career, the rest of my life. I'm a kid that grew up in the streets of New York City. I'm going to make a change in this city that I love so much and make it a better place for everyone. But that wasn't the plan of action for me. September 2003, I begin university, and America is 6 months into the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the topic of the Middle East is everywhere. Everywhere. People who have never thought of the Middle East before are majoring in Middle East studies. Everyone's taking in international relations. Everyone's about the Middle East. And obviously Israel is part of that topic. And for me, the turning was it was a comparative study of the partition of Mandate Palestine and of India and Pakistan. All right, so it was a comparative study. It was a very interesting course. And so the morning that the lecture is going to begin on Israel, the Middle East, I walked into class and I said, oh, I'm going to go. I'm going to say, no idea. Up in front of us, and she begins a lecture on what I thought was a very positive note. She says, I'm going to teach you all this morning, before we get started, about the history of anti-Semitism in the Middle East. I was like, wow, that's good. So that's in the right direction. She's going to give some base here. I'm really surprised. The professor was a Palestinian Jordanian. I didn't know she was going to go in that direction at all. And she continues the lecture, and she gave specific examples. And one example she really delved into the Farhud, the Jewish community in Baghdad in June of 1941. So she's giving all the details on what happened, and the looting of stores, and the assault on women, and the murders, so on and so forth. And then towards the end, she says the following. She goes, but the most important part of this event, of this historical event, the issue that most people do not know, that the Farhud, the pogrom against the Jewish community in Baghdad, was planned and perpetrated by the Israeli Mossad. And I was like, ¿Cómo se what? It was one of those moments I said, wait, something's happening here. I mean, I know maybe I went to sleep a little bit late. I know I'm not kind of 100% here. It's too early in the morning. What did she just say? I remember turning around and I said, what did she say? He's like, yeah, that thing is right to their own. No. And so I waited for my just spent seminary, and I told her dad, she's going to say, and now, and I'm like, pipe in here. Yes. Even say what distracted everyone speaking with us will not respect time ago. Let's say here to go into the no modern most side and unrelated all of this. We got into the apartment. Welcome to class. I'm going to let's sense people being a Jewish nations within is how so she of course Michelle trying to care. It was for me, or maybe have a little bit of care to. I feel balance and it's where for myself that helped activists. I saw. I 4 years, and that was in high school. Everyone knew one. I didn't anything but bad kids, and so I say I'm going to make myself outcast. Easy thing to do. Being political, when it would have been different. Taking a okay. No, these learning with them. It's 4 years, and I'm able to say 15 years back. I thing, and I be intimidating. Sometimes difficult students. Okay, let's see. We're all close. Stuff happens. How do we go?
Yes. That's how I could see this.
Amazing.
Where are those lights? Entirely even. Put it in the middle there.
Okay, this I control from here, right?
Yeah.
All right. It may be blasting.
Is your computer charged? Ish.
Maybe. We can give it a shot. See what happens. It'll warn me if not. Okay.
Power.
Amazing. All right. I want to give you all an example. Campus. Any of your this because we have a very very influential. We use these issues. Campus during the deal with it. Coming years. School in the West. Okay. Good because it's very systems are deal with. UC, UCC, very examples of places we are dealing with sentiment. The technique being is attractive, differentiate. Hear me use pro-Palestinian. I think students that are genuine say we have the Palestinian their own state, Palestinian fulfillment, so on, but we also right, so on and so forth. You can have a engagement, encourage you to. Anti is not interested in campaigning Israel through campaign cases campaigns. But you have governments opinions on campaigns how believably become the Senate or the UN and creating all types of resolutions and lobbying movements, so on and so forth, to get their university to. I want more difficult right outside of. No. Right. If I a blonde, I'm not.
Divest. So tonight, they've been systemic vaccines police happening in with the knowledge of Israeli.
So basically, is students attending students that hold universities and all ties with Israel, namely academic students. How do universities make revenue? Right, they invest. They invest in different businesses, especially major universities. The universities like Columbia who have, I don't even know, like an annual budget of, I know Cornell's is like $700 million a year or something like that. So there are universities that are investing in all types of different businesses, hedge funds, so on and so forth, in order to keep the revenue coming to the university. A lot of American universities invest in Israeli businesses, whatever it may be, startup companies, Iskar, things of that nature. So they are trying to get their universities to stop any type of investments or cooperations with Israeli companies in order to help them create this political ploy against the country. It's very smart. And by the way, if they pass the resolution at the end of the university sign onto it, more than likely no. Universities, like nations, are interested in what is going to help them profit and aren't really going to get into the nitty-gritty of what students on their campus are arguing about. But more than that, as far as PR is concerned, it's brilliant. It looks really, really bad, especially when you have some of the finer universities that are getting the attention. Because they have pushed the boycott, divestment, and sanctions issue so much on university campuses, we actually have found the professor who came out, he was actually the dean of students of Catholic University, Israel, the dean of Catholic University and the provost of the university. He came out and he led the campaign. He had 250 university deans and provosts sign on from across the U.S. to sign on to a letter basically stating that they will not even allow these resolution panels to come up in their universities, let alone be passed. So it was really surprising that we have found that many people are very like-minded. It's not a Jewish issue for them. For them, it's an issue of this cannot be tolerated at our universities. But nonetheless, the intimidation factor. Imagine you're sitting there, a Jewish student. As much as it's easy for us to now, in retrospect, watch this and kind of laugh it off or say how ridiculous it is, you're sitting in one of these halls and you're listening to your peers who are absorbing this nonsense. Yes, Israel has legalized sterilization of Ethiopian women so that there is orgy going on in the Sinai Desert or whatever else is happening. And then the sheer cheers and the elation that you hear after it's passed, it's very intimidating. Yeah.
We'll probably get to this, but people who say these things, and like your teacher who said like Messiah was written, do they have proof? Do they have documents written by Palestinians?
It's an excellent question. So something we very much believe as an organization, Stand With Us believes and promotes the idea that a lie told a million times is still a lie, right? But if you say it enough, people will begin to believe you. And facts are relevant. Everyone can choose to bring in their facts. When it comes to professors, something that we encourage, and I encourage all of you to do, is to bring primary sources to professors. That's what they respect. They're going to want an academic source. They're going to want a primary source to prove their case. If a professor is politically motivated, when I was studying at Pace, at the time, I don't know if she's still there, but the head of like the multicultural department, the woman who had to give you permission for all of the Hillel events on campus or the Arab Alliance events on campus or whatever it was on campus that was going on, when you went to her door in the admin building, she had a copy of Yasser Arafat's acceptance speech of the Nobel Peace Prize. Yeah, okay, give me a break. Like, I know this woman is definitely very fair-minded. So a lot of times the administration will let you know right away where they stand on a lot of these issues. By the way, don't be mistaken. We do not lack either fair-minded and or pro-Israel professors on college campuses. They are not in the minority at all. The problem is getting a lot of them to speak out. And we work with organizations like Scholars for Peace in the Middle East who are trying to change the dynamic, and there are a lot of very, very good professors, deans, provosts, so on and so forth, who are trying to ensure that this is not happening on campus. The main obstacle to promoting Israel is apathy. Okay? Most students are apathetic, and by the way, this can very much be the case within the Jewish community. Let's not be mistaken. All right? Many people are apathetic. They don't really care. You will find 5 or 10% of people who will strongly agree with you, and 5 or 10% of people who will strongly disagree with you, and then a whole 80 or 90% who are sitting in the middle. Those are the individuals that you want to influence when you're on campus. All right? How do you do that? If you remember nothing at all from what I've spoken to you guys about this morning, remember one thing. I don't know. Sometimes I don't know is the best answer possible, because you want to become a reliable source of information. And the second you make up a fact, or you exaggerate something, or you just kind of pull something out of the air because you're not sure, you lose your legitimacy and your reputation amongst that person or amongst that group. All right? So if someone comes to you and they say, well, we understand according to the Oslo Accords, Israel is responsible for the transfer of 500,000 cubic meters of water each week, and up until now they've been transferring 372,000. You don't work for the Israel Water Authority, okay? Maybe you know the answer, maybe you don't. It doesn't matter. But in that moment, because you're not a walking encyclopedia and you're not sure, you turn around and you say, you know what? I'm not really well versed on that issue specifically. I'm more than happy to look into it and to find you a reputable source and get back to you. All right? That's a mistake that I oftentimes see, very well intended. I mean, these are students that have the best of intention in mind, but the second you start to make things up or tell someone you're lying, and if they're not lying, it's even worse, then you lose your legitimacy as a reliable source of information. Keep that in mind, okay? When is criticism of Israel anti-Semitic? And this is very important as you guys prepare to go onto campus. Not all criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. We know that. All you have to do is turn on the 8 o'clock news here in Israel, and you'll understand that not all criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. We live in an active democracy. As part of being an active democracy, people have criticisms. When you ask a lot of the foreign journalists who are here in Israel where they get their news from, where they get their stories from, they'll say, we don't have to do much of anything because we just get it from our Israeli counterparts, right? You have Haaretz, you have Ynet, you have J-Post, you have Arutz Sheva. You have all of these international outlets that are going out in English where people can access information, they can debate, they can dialogue, they can criticize, so on and so forth. But part of that is that people take advantage of that situation, understanding that we live in a generation that is very politically correct, is very, very careful about what they say and how they say it. And so today, very real anti-Israel cover really is, and it's dangerous. I coalitions encourage you. First of all, you can't just mind students on them to take if they for that. So invest on campus, right? And this care about what we need to as well. Sometimes, if any watch the debate UCLA, with nothing, which no debate went hours from until 6 non-stop at UCLA. I about 2.5 minutes of your piece, 2.5 minutes. You do 15 of people got up there and said, we are for the divestment resolution because of, we are against the divestment resolution because of. In the end, the vote of the student government against divestment at UCLA came down to a vote of 5-6. 5-6 with the resolution not passing. So if people argue with you that campus activism is pointless, it's not important, 65. 5-6, and when I tell you Bruins for Israel, the pro-Israel group on the campus, they were working non-stop, day and night, non-stop, day and night. One of the most, not surprising necessarily, but important things that you will watch, if any of you watch the footage from the UCLA divestment debate, was that a lot of the people who were standing up to testify were neither Palestinian, Arab, or Muslim. A lot of them at UCLA specifically were Filipino students, right? And if you look specifically and you think about Filipino students, what happened very recently in the Philippines? Major natural disaster. Who was one of the first countries to respond to it? Israel. And so the hypocrisy and the irony that Filipino American students are now calling for a divestment vote against Israel, there is something here that's lacking. And when you speak to a lot of the students, what is lacking here? They are being approached, spoken to, lobbied, however you want to refer to it, by the anti-Israel groups on their campus. And the Jewish students on their campus are not necessarily engaging with them. So we have to keep that in mind. When is criticism of Ismatic? This is that Natan Sharansky came up with, and I think it's a very good one.
Who?
Natan Sharansky. He is currently the head of the Jewish Agency, and he's served in a number of positions. So the Deputy Prime Minister of Israel. He is a former Soviet Union refusnik, a Zionist refusnik. So Natan Sharansky said the following, the 3 Ds. Delegitimization, the Jewish state has no right to exist. This is the biggest issue that we're dealing with today, people questioning Israel's very right to exist as a Jewish state. The first thing that you should do in a question like this, in a scenario like this, is give people the benefit of the doubt. All right? A lot of times they don't know, they don't understand. I don't have time to show it to you guys, but we have this hysterical video we did at UCLA about 3 years ago where we run around campus asking random students about their perspective on the Middle East. We asked questions like, what's the only democracy in the Middle East? We got responses like Iran, Syria, so on and so forth. How many Jewish countries are there? 6, 14, 12. People honestly have no idea. Again, going back to the issue of apathy. I'll give you guys a great case in point that speaks to a lot of young people. And of course, I know you've never watched it, and you should never watch it. The Jersey Shore. Season 1 of The Jersey Shore. There's an Israeli girl that finds her way onto the show. Of course, she finds her way onto the show. And she has fallen in love with the famous DJ Pauly D. And on one scene, they're hanging out back at the shore house, and Vinny comes running into the shore house, and it's like, oh my goodness, dude, running onto this fight on the boardwalk. We got the people with the cops. We got to go get him, blah, 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 blah. Most famous fight of the season. God bless the Italian-American community, and I imagine the pain that they go through watching this show. So there's a scene that ensues, and Daniela is twirling her hair and being very adorable and flirtatious, and she goes, "You are acting like Israeli men when you behave this way." And Vinny responds in the following manner. Vinny, who has no connection to the Middle East, who probably has the IQ of an ant, who asks in testimonial, do these Jewish people even believe in Jesus? Has no idea what's going on whatsoever. What is his association with Israel? How does he respond? No, if we was Jewish guys, if we was Israeli guys, we'd do this. Boom, 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 boom. And he makes this gesture of a gun, right? And as if he's shooting the gun. So he has no correlation to Israel. Obviously, has never been to Israel, will never be here, has no understanding about the conflict, but what he does associate with Israeli men is that they do not fight with their hands, they fight with guns. So as much as we have apathy, and people may not care, and it doesn't really affect their lives day to day, the attitude or the perception is still very negative. And that's very dangerous for my generation and your generation. I'm, 10 years older than you guys? It's very dangerous because my generation had a 16-second attention span. It's estimated that your generation has a 4-second attention span.
What?
It's horrific, right? Exactly. It's terrible. When I teach kids that are like 14 or 15 years old, if within 60 seconds I have not made a funny voice or told some ridiculous story, they are lost, gone. I'm not going to gain them again. And so combine that with constant news cycles and negative images, you have an end result where people just have a very negative perception. It's Israel measures accepted when I know a lot for, let's say, pocket situation in Israel. It's what it's in America for the government. I think it's a very mundane question. We know the answer to it and to use stations, but what we really need to and what people will pick at on this or of is their race, right? Much racism in Israel, racism in Israel, racism in the United States, Australia, or wherever nations that I are often getting it as cleansing. So on all of these that are being used absolutely have relevant. As I can take and say, you have this. So Israel, show you guys very extremely this 11 days. There's an incident. There are 2 youths killed. Have happened on the calendar of Israel's independence. We know it the day of, and so throughout in some of the neighborhoods in Jerusalem, incident protest right and in open term of the one was the best that is going is multi, but I have here addition to play with that was released a video that shot with. I'm using this on purpose live, and they are that they were being shot to watch. Okay, this the reason why we're here. That took place in prison. So to in outside of.
الشباب كان لازم طبعا السلطات حقيقة ضبط منها واحد يعني ما 4 نزلوا في بلاد من اللي كان الاستشفاف ما شيء يعني اشتباك او رمي حجاره او شيء متكررين كثير. الجهه اللي وقعت منها على الاغلبيه اللي في ساحه عوفقيه، ساحه عوفق في زاويه هناك ممكن ان منها، وهذا اكيد جدا.
Okay, that's second youth that they're claiming. What do you guys notice about
It's very hard to see.
what's that?
It's very hard.
It's hard to see. Okay, anybody realize the time? They were an hour and 20 apart. Okay, one was at 8 and the other one was around 3 in the afternoon. So the IDF is they know it's within one another. And this what the IDF is that what you see here, by the way, Migdal, if shot with live ammunition, live bullet, with an actual bullet, they're not going to this and hit the ground, put their arm for them, and then somehow plie or train in the air. Did that?
I'm not sure how you're supposed to fall in the
So, well, here, argument is that one of the arguments at play is that they reveal many outside organizations. The idea of this, the Israeli government cannot. But what is very reminiscent of that okay happened where and if you YouTube it, there are tons of videos. In 2001, after the Operation Defensive Shield, there was a funeral procession on that was called Body the Gurney after the procession. Because there was no body in it, it was an actual person who was alive and well that was hopping in and out. So scenes were set up in order to capture the attention, because the psychological war and the effect of the psychological war is much more powerful than traditional weapon, right? Because if we can amass enough attention and enough negative attention towards Israel, then we can achieve our goal. This video here is very questionable for a number of reasons. If someone was shot with live fire, an hour later, you're not going to have a group of people proceeding around this move. Nobody's going to investigate. There's no blood. All of these out there in the air. Again, the idea here, video, an image, is very little to go. It's not what happened. Displayed here is that big challenge. The campaign investigation wants information. The organization has right juxtaposition in a mug, smash hide this top that says that has to do with the theater, very popular. About 7 of Texas, there were 5 of children that were set up campus. Children, all of the signs that were nearby stated that represent responsible for the past time. The dying NYU is quite often, and 12 noon courtyard dying so put math techniques to not only Israel students, but that for your mind. It's just going the who want is find the balance. Find the balance, facts, in history, so on and so forth, and personalizing the story. We've lacked. You can't have. There has to be a here, but it should be very much understood that not only Israel as a country and as a diplomatic force, but the pro-Israel students on campus, this is what we're up against. A group of individuals who are playing by a very, very different set of rules. We need to learn how to anti. It's very simple. Against Israel, 3 main occupation, and racism. For racism, really important. That's the 4. We come from American, right? So where every other day in the media, when I was growing up, I remember in my housing project there was a young black kid. He was probably 14 or 15 years old. He was chasing and fought him. He said, my asthma. I'm just it's a serious having an asthma. They threw control hard. Kids blew. Dropped dead. He wasn't playing. He was literally too. Yeah, you do good, right? We can sit there in their job, argue with their race about something in the same case. You have every can argue force or individuals. It means this that country, and that's how we have these conversations. The role of I'm going to go conflict.
Just to clarify, suggesting that Israel does degrees of racism in other countries that
absolutely. I think if something happens,
Israel doesn't suffer from a higher degree of racism against, for instance, the Arab world than other.
There's no compare, but here I think we have to be careful about. I don't want Israel to be compared, and we don't want Israel to be compared to Syria. We're not Syria, right? We are a country that's in the Middle East, but we don't play by the rules of the Middle East. We play by the rules, and we're built on the values of Western democracies. So when something does happen, okay, when it does happen, when it's legitimate and when it's real, when there's an example of Tag Mahir, for example, all right? And so a group of very extreme right-wing youth have gone and they've set fire to a mosque. And it's happened and it's proven. The police are saying it, and the army is saying it. Then it's okay to say it happened. It happened, and it's not something that I'm proud of, and I know it's not something society is proud of. But on that note, that's how we differ, is because we want to pursue these people. We want them to know that it's not okay. We are not promoting it in our civil society, in our educational system at all. The same way that I'm sure you can find incidences in New York or Boston or LA where you also have individuals who have taken parts in that are similar, but it doesn't mean it labels the entire society. And that's what you have to be careful with.
But you're suggesting that even though Israel's enemies happen to be mostly Arab, which I think is the same assumption, you're therefore assuming that somehow Israel views their enemies as being enemies, but has no racial bias against them. My kids go to school here. They come home, and when I drive by Arab villages, Israeli Arab villages, my daughter looks out the window and says, Arvim, Arvim, and she gets scared. That's producing now I'm not saying it's not, justification is a separate issue, but I think the average non-Jewish college person, they're going to say, that sounds pretty racist to me. That's the same racism as if I'm walking in New York. I think the owner of a basketball team just said this. He said if he sees a black person wearing a hood, he will walk to the other side of the street. Right? That sounds like fairly racial profiling. So again, the question is, you don't think this country suffers to a greater degree because of the fact that
Oh, absolutely. I understand what you're saying now. I think relating it to something that a young person can relate to is very important because they will appreciate that and they'll understand. Look, I was in South Africa on my third or fourth trip there, and we were leaving like an ice cream shop, and it was chilly, so I put my hood on, and they said, no, you're not allowed to put your hood on. And I was like, what? And they said, no, there's a law in South Africa. You're not allowed to walk around with a hood on. And I said, why? They said, because there's such a high crime rate in the country. And I'm like, where am I? Right? So I couldn't relate to it at that point. I grew up in New York. I can't put a hoodie on. I think when something does happen, adding in your point, which is that because there is a conflict here, and because there is a genuine fear amongst people of elements within the Arab population, then you can say that, yeah, factor, but it's the same reasons that one may feel that way in New York or LA or anywhere else here. It's based off of the fact that there is a major conflict that has gone on for many years that includes attacks, all types of horrific incidences against Jewish Israelis, and as a result, people have yes, adding in that point. But I think the problem is that students, if you deny it completely, and if there's proof of it, you would be shocked by the level of testimony or evidence that students. I had someone once come to me during a debate and say, how can you say Israel is not promoting apartheid when they're separating Sephardi girls from Ashkenazi girls in school in Emmanuel? Kid, city, right? As Indian, at the age of 20, know that there's a separation between girls. It's a religious issues, so on and so. Nonetheless, if I can take that and I can use it and I can label it, I'm going to. And that's the dynamic that we're dealing with, which is that individual stories that are everyday stories that are really not big deals in the scheme of things, they're becoming major headlines. And people are pursuing them so much so that we have to be able to have a conversation that not only puts it into perspective, we can't make Israel so different. I think because we've made Israel so different for so many years, people do not relate to it. It's the reason why you'll ask the average American, would you ever come to Israel on vacation? No. Why would I go to Israel on vacation? Or why would you go to Italy on vacation? Or why would you go to Greece on vacation? You have the same beautiful Mediterranean, you have the same history, you have even longer history, you have the same amazing restaurant. Why? Because the perception is so negative, because people feel that they can't relate. So I think we have to be very careful about striking that balance, that yes, it's different, and yes, Israel's dealing with a very unique and a very serious conflict, but at the same time, we deal with issues as a society, just like we do in America. So it's about striking that balance. Okay? Yeah.
So the question was what?
It's all right. We'll tell you later.
Yeah.
All right.
Can I ask another question?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I just want to, because it's a comment I've heard from young people, non-Jewish people on campus, which is that notion of Israel being both in the
Jewish state.
Right, which becomes Israel self suffers from that problem.
Excellent question. It's an excellent question. So how can Israel be both a democracy and a Jewish state, and is there a conflict within it? So I think ways that we best deal with it is giving comparisons of other countries. For example, the Queen is the head of England, right? She's the head of the UK, she's the head of government. What else is she the head of? The church. She stands at the head of the church. The UK, with the cross on your flag, and the same thing in Switzerland, all of these other countries. We have to keep in mind that countries, even though they may be forthright saying we are a Christian country, or in Turkey we are a traditionally Muslim country, that's the scenario in a lot of countries. Very much the same, whereas here in Israel, right, you have a country that's built on, when we said the Pledge of Allegiance as kids in America, we know that we're not to Hashem. We live in a Christian majority country whose foundations are built on Christian values, all right? But we're still minorities that live safely there, that practice our own religion, so on and so forth. Argument.
I put it a different way. In other words, if I'm a non-Jew and I apply to university, the university is obligated, cannot bias me because of my religious background. But if I want to become a citizen of this country, I'm applying.
Specifically, the right of return. Poland has a right of return. Poland has a right of return. Pakistan has a right of return. There are a number of countries that have a right of return. And the same way we can't dictate to those countries what those laws should be based on, we cannot. There's a reason why we have a right of return. It's because, as we can see, and give them very real. Just yesterday in Belgium, you had this horrific attack. Two Israelis were murdered. 2 museum workers were murdered. Israel not only is a modern-day democracy, but it also will be, and has always been, a place that Jews know that they can come to. After being on the receiving end of persecution and levels of oppression for thousands of years, Israel not only serves as a modern-day democracy, where you have 23% of the population which is not Jewish, the majority of that 23% being Muslim, okay? We also have to have a country where Jews know that they can turn to, and that's why that law is in place. Okay? Well, here. Yeah. All right? You should do also return. It's not just Israel. It's not just Israel at all. Okay, we are completely timed out, but I'm going to close with you guys just with some images. A lot of why Israel does not use difficult images, let's say after terrorists, video footage. Many people have asked me this question. A lot of young students ask this question. Israel's enemies, Hamas, Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, they understand the effectiveness of images, of very difficult images. Israel knows that no matter what it does, when it's going to take part in an operation, let's say in the Gaza Strip, there are going to be civilian casualties. That's why it took Israel so many years to decide to go in on a ground offensive and see no matter what you're dealing with her and to among and as a result, they're going to have innocent people that he killed. Because of that, using the images has come to an advantage of Israel's enemies. And in 2006, southern Lebanon, the city of Qana was accidentally shelled, and as a result, because of the number of women and children who were killed, the UN told Israel that it had to stop its offensive for a 24-hour period, and the government did the same as well. So by releasing such strong imagery and videos, so on and so forth, groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, and Islamic Jihad, they can achieve their goals without using conventional. This is the name of the game, the psychological warfare that's being waged against Israel today, and that's what we feel in terms of the media and on college campuses. We feel the end result of that psychological warfare. There was a bit of a shift when the Fogel family, may their memories be of when the Fogel in March 2011, the families that the Israeli government support them in their decision to release the images. Now, I apologize for a second if I speak about very pragmatic and cold terms. In terms of what was happening in the media, in the international media, we had the earthquake in Japan, okay? That was at the front, obviously, of every news hour. And as a result, this story, I think, which potentially, because of the background and because of the imagery, would have gotten a lot more attention, it didn't. But nonetheless, because the images were released, you saw a real change amongst people who were talking about it. Anyone who had seen the image, as much as you could describe how horrific this was, it didn't matter until you saw the image of a baby, literally a baby, lying there in its own blood. There is nothing, no amount of words could shift you. So it was an interesting, it was an event people dealt with. They, because they're out there, but as the Israeli government is concerned, or the idea for any official Israeli body, clips like this are not released for very simple reasons. Pikuach nefesh, right? The sanctity of life. You understand that anyone who has been killed tragically or hurt, they are someone's brother, sister, friend, neighbor, whomever it may be, and their life is pure. And to take an image and use it that way is not something that Israel is going to do. While we are aware that that's what Israel's enemies do. Why Israel? There's a genuine delusion that a solution to this conflict will equal world peace. That's why you will find so many young people are concerned about it. This is the best conflict zone ever. What do we mean by this being the best conflict zone ever? Think about it. What other country in the world with today can you have foreign journalists that are running around all over the place and getting interest stories, being in clubs and hotels and beaches in the world, all right? This is a great place to cover the news. This is a fantastic conflict to cover if you're going to cover one, and that's why it's constantly being discussed in terms of the media. We spoke about the divestment issue on campus. Cultural boycott is also a very interesting campaign that Israel's enemies are using. It's extremely effective because for a lot of young people, we may know what our university's policies are. Okay, if we're lucky, we know what our country's foreign policy is. But what we do know for sure is what our favorite singer is doing, what our favorite actor is doing. And a Twitter account making it, i.e., I will not go and perform in Israel because it's an apartheid state, well, that's going to get the attention of a lot of people. The BDS is targeting Elvis Costello, the Pixies, the Gorillas, hitting them not to Israel to perform because Israel is an apartheid state, because Israel is committing genocide and ethnic cleansing. So Pixies are coming to perform next. To cancel the situation. This is questionable, but it has been effective with Elvis Costello, with Santana. They have all canceled trips to Israel. They have canceled trips to Israel, canceled performances in Israel. The good news is that on the fighting end of it, there are a lot of organizations working against this. So the big name people, Madonna, Justin Timberlake, yes, all of the big names are still coming, performing. They've sold 8 tickets in an hour and a half. They had to make a second performance. Like, can you imagine the 35 to 40-year-old Israeli girls that are going to be running to go see them? It's going to be amazing. So they're not being effective in that term. But again, if they can create a sentiment, that's what they're going to do. What we're doing on campus is really trying to help create a scenario where you guys feel more prepared of the information that you have, the accessibility to the HaTorah of resources. I have printed materials here to share with you. Feel more prepared to deal with what's happening on campus. You cannot have the same conversation with your professor to have with next to you in biology lab. You need to keep that in mind. What a lot of people, they ask, what are the best messages in terms of Israel? Well, the first one is that Israel is a democracy in action. Don't speak about how different Israel is, but speak about how like-minded it is in terms of America, okay, when it comes to democracy and what that means. And democracies are imperfect. Remember that. And remember that when you're having conversations with people. So you can sit there and you can say to them, well, you can pick and choose at Israel and say, well, there's this example and that example. Democracies are imperfect, and we have to judge Israel based on how well it's dealing with its imperfections rather than all of our lovely neighbors here in the Middle East to deal with their imperfections through very different means. Sacrifices for peace, based on polls of American college students, students do not believe supporters of Israel when they say that it is in peace. That is it more. Give them a sign. Okay? Students, I don't care if you're left, is your concern. Do an image, and I tell you, and I answer and say until B'nai. Same. I don't care that the removal from the Gush Katif, the disengagement, was the worst decision the Israeli government ever made, or the best thing since sliced bread. It doesn't matter. What matters is that do not know and are not connected to this scenario, that you have to paint a picture for them of what it meant. 10,000 people to physically be in their homes in a call for peace that regrettably did not. That tore at the core of Israeli society. I was 19 years old when this happened, and you saw people who thought that the Israeli government had to do it or shouldn't do it. On that day, everyone sat there, their jaw, what it meant, and broke. Wherever you were broke. And you can right to tell to feel that make this type of compromise, for whatever be, it's not successful, it doesn't work, so on and so forth. But with that said, Israel would probably as a nation committed to peace. We are that committed to peace. And then go for it. Tell them whatever it is that you feel, as long as it's with fact and you can back it up. But first, you're presenting a picture to them that they can, okay? Israel Beyond. Israel Beyond has the potential, okay? Teaching about issues or topics that have nothing to do with the conflict, that are about Israel as a startup nation, Israeli innovations, technologies, humanity, whatever it may be. That has tremendous potential on a lot of campuses. But first, you have to atmosphere. Harvard University, years ago, there was a 2-day conference on Israel as a startup nation. There were 900 attendees at this conference. 900. The vast majority of them were not Jewish. They were MBA students. They were students who were interested in business, technology, innovation, investment. And there was an environment created on campus that had nothing to do with the conflict, but that was all Israel in a very positive light. But when students respond to apartheid cleansing and it, well, we invented the cherry tomato. It doesn't work. Okay? Doesn't work. Bad idea. Diverse because it's uncomfortable for you. Fit there, and it's and it everything else. These are images from part of our Israel resources. We have dealt very directly with the conflict. Copies of the Hamas Charter. We were shocked every year at AIPAC Policy Conference. Frank Luntz, who's like this big, he's the guy who teaches words that work. I mean, just kind of teaches everyone how to speak, what works, lobbying techniques. So Frank Luntz always asking questions at a policy conference. Usually he has a huge turnout in his sessions, 400 or 500 people. How many of the Hamas show of hands? Now these are the biggest, right? The best of the pro-Israel activists in the United States. 10, 12, 14,000 people there. He always asks the same question, and maybe percent of maybe. So a number of years ago, we produced a copy of the Hamas Charter in English so that people can see it, they can read it, they can know what it says, so that we're not just referring to it. Have proof it's set. So some of the things deal with United Nations, human rights in the Middle East, Israel 101, and then some of them deal with humanitarian aid and environmental, diverse things that go beyond the conflict and that are fun and interesting. And so what you get to what type of here already exists here. If it's one that is not negative about Israel, then that's great. Take advantage of that and concentrating on it. If it's one like NYU that has become a little bit more difficult, then you really need to deal very directly with what's happening on it. And the first step in doing that is asking what has taken place so far at that school. I'm more than happy to put you guys with our campus coordinators in the States so that they can tell you about your individual campuses and what the atmosphere has been the next year, and to put you in touch with the leadership on that campus so that you're not just being thrown in there, but you're really kind of feeling it out before you get there. Look, I know that this seems like a big, huge issue, and people really have a genuine concern of not knowing what to say in a certain scenario. I started at point zero, okay? I had no knowledge of Israel. Remember after my mother said to me, I keep telling your sister she's got to save water. She takes such long showers. And I'm like, I know, Mom, but leave her alone. Like, it's a lost cause. It doesn't really matter. And she's like, no, because water in Israel. What? No water in Israel. I'm like, what does that have to do with Alicia taking a long shower? I'm so... You think you saving helps me in Israel? I'm like, no. No. Definitely. Okay? To ask the big questions. We have an international network of young activists who are dealing with this, and we're here for you, to support you, to help you guys do it. So I encourage you to become involved with Stand With Us on our campus, because we're the best, and anyone who's the best says that we're the best. We really are. And feel of a greater group. So even if you're in a situation where you feel by yourself, always know that there are a group of people standing behind you. And we want to help support you so that you feel better prepared for your conversations on campus. Starting with in November, student conference about across North. We flew out to Los Angeles for a weekend of learning with all of the top speakers, trainers. I go out to the conference to speak. Itamar Marcus from Palestinian Media Watch, Neil Lazarus. So we're dealing with everything so that you guys feel better prepared for campus. So that's something I encourage you to do. And I also have my information here as well as our booklet so that you can shoot me an email and I can put you in touch with your appropriate campus coordinator if you guys are interested in becoming more active on campus. Okay? So Baba, we're done. Thank you guys. It's nice to meet you.